Imagine being born into a royal family, surrounded by soldiers, wealth, power, and ambition. Most children born into such a world might dream of becoming king. But Alexander wanted something much bigger. He wanted to conquer the world. Before he became one of the most famous military commanders in history, Alexander was simply a young prince growing up in the small kingdom of Macedon. And the story of how that boy became Alexander the Great begins long before he ever commanded an army. It begins with his father and with a childhood that was anything but ordinary. Alexander was born in 356 BC in Pella, the capital of Macedon. His father was Philip II, the powerful king of Macedon. His mother was Olympias, a strong-willed woman from Epirus who would have an enormous influence on Alexander's life. From the moment Alexander was born, expectations surrounded him. He wasn't just a child, he was the son of a king, and one day he was expected to inherit the throne. But Philip had plans for his son that went far beyond simply becoming king. Philip was transforming Macedon into one of the strongest powers in the Greek world. He reorganized the army, strengthened the famous Macedonian phalanx, expanded his territory, and brought rival Greek states under Macedonian influence. Alexander grew up watching all of this. War was not something he heard about in stories. It was part of the world around him. And perhaps most importantly, Alexander grew up watching his father win. Again and again. But there was something Alexander wanted more than anything else. He wanted to prove that he could accomplish something greater than his father. As a young prince, Alexander received an education unlike that of an ordinary child. One of his most famous teachers was a man whose ideas would influence the world for centuries. His name was Aristotle. Philip invited Aristotle to teach Alexander and several other young nobles. Under Aristotle, Alexander studied philosophy, politics, literature, science, medicine, and other subjects. But Alexander wasn't only interested in books. He was fascinated by the heroes of the past. One figure in particular captured his imagination: Achilles, the legendary warrior of the Trojan War. Alexander admired Achilles so deeply that later traditions say he considered himself connected to the legendary hero. He wanted glory. He wanted his name to survive long after he was gone. And Aristotle's lessons gave him something even more important: a way of thinking. Alexander was learning not only how to fight, but how to understand people, politics, geography, and the world around him. But there was another side to Alexander's personality. According to ancient accounts, he could be extremely ambitious. He wasn't satisfied with simply being good. He wanted to be the best. There is a famous story about Alexander and his father that illustrates this perfectly. One day, Philip's soldiers struggled to control a powerful horse named Bucephalus. The horse was wild and appeared impossible to tame. But Alexander noticed something others had missed. The horse was frightened by its own shadow. So Alexander turned the animal toward the sun, mounted it, and managed to calm it. Whether every detail of the story is accurate or not, the tale became part of Alexander's legend, and it tells us something important about how later generations remembered him. Alexander wasn't portrayed as someone who simply accepted that something was impossible. He looked for another way, and Bucephalus would eventually become his famous companion on campaigns across Asia. Alexander's childhood did not remain peaceful for long. When he was still a teenager, his father began involving him in military affairs. Alexander wasn't being prepared for a comfortable life in a palace. He was being prepared to rule, and he would soon get his first real taste of power. In 338 BC, Philip II faced a major confrontation with Athens and Thebes at the Battle of Chaeronea. Alexander was only about 18 years old, yet he was given an important command. The young prince entered battle alongside experienced Macedonian soldiers, and Macedon emerged victorious. The battle helped establish Macedonian dominance over much of Greece. For Alexander, it was more than just a victory. It was proof that he could command men in war. He was no longer simply the king's son. He was becoming a military leader. But Alexander's relationship with his father was complicated. Philip was powerful, ambitious, and successful. But Alexander was ambitious too, and the royal family was filled with tension. Philip and Olympias often disagreed. Political marriages created rivalries. Questions about succession created uncertainty. Alexander was growing up in an environment where power could change hands quickly, and he was learning an important lessons. Being born a prince did not guarantee that you would remain powerful. You had to fight to keep your position. Then, in 336 BC, everything changed. Philip II was assassinated. Alexander was only 20 years old. Suddenly, the young prince became king. And now he faced a terrifying problem. Enemies saw an opportunity. Several Greek states began challenging Macedonian control. Alexander could have tried to negotiate. Instead, he acted quickly. He marched south and demonstrated that Macedon's power had not disappeared with Philip. The young king crushed the rebellion and restored Macedonian authority. But this was only the beginning. Alexander had inherited something far more valuable than a throne. He had inherited his father's army and his father's unfinished dream. Philip had planned an enormous campaign against the Persian Empire. Now Alexander had a choice. He could remain in Greece and rule the kingdom his father had built. Or he could cross into Asia and attempt something that seemed almost impossible: conquer the Persian Empire. Alexander chose the second option, and that decision would change the course of history. At just 20 years old, Alexander was king. He had already fought in battle, he had already defeated enemies, and now he was preparing to leave Europe behind. Ahead of him stood the Persian Empire, a vast superpower with enormous wealth, territory, and armies. Alexander didn't know exactly how far his journey would take him. He didn't know that he would eventually reach lands thousands of miles from Macedon, and he certainly didn't know that his name would become legendary. But one thing was clear: the boy who once dreamed of becoming greater than his father was about to begin the greatest adventure of his life. And the next chapter would begin with Alexander crossing into Asia. This was the beginning of the conquest that would make him Alexander the Great.